Today's video is on viruses, and if you look at these pictures here, you can see some of the common viruses, and you've all experienced a virus before. Most of you have had a cold or the flu, and that would be the nice little picture of this little guy up here in the left-hand corner. That's the typical flu virus. The one over on the right-hand side here, that is the typical virus that infects bacteria, because they can be infected as well. Down here we have the lovely Ebola virus, which is nasty, nasty. It makes you bleed from all the holes in your body, and it's really disgusting and can often be fatal. Then down below we have a wide range of other viruses, which would be the tobacco mosaic virus, which infects plants. So let's look at our objectives for this video, and then we'll proceed. First objective is you want to be able to describe the structure of viruses. Describe how a virus enters a host cell, describe how a virus replicates in a host cell, and be able to give examples of common viruses. You have some key vocabulary there that I'd like to see in your notes. Make sure they're included. Virus, protein coat, capsid, envelope, lytic, lysogenetic, cycles, retinovirus, pathogen, and vaccine. So what are viruses? They are basically referred to as kind of like genes in a box. They're particles that are made up of a nucleic acid, and they're either made up of DNA or RNA, depends on which virus you're talking about, and they're enclosed or surrounded by a protein coat called a capsid. If you look at these pictures over here, we have one with the influenza virus that is made up of RNA as its nucleic acid, and then it has the lovely hexagonal protein coat around it. Now, the influenza virus is unique too because it has something that some viruses have, but not all, and that is a bilayer envelope around it. And that bilayer envelope allows that to stick to our cells and be infused with our cells and easily get into our cells. On the other hand, you have this lovely little rocket-shaped bacteriophage, which is a virus that infects bacteria. It's actually made up of the nucleotide or the nucleic acid DNA. It also has a protein coat. Nasty little thing it is. What are viruses not then? They are not made up of cells. Therefore, they're not considered a living organism. They do not have the ability to reproduce or survive on their own. They need another mechanism to help them multiply and make more of their little parts. They cannot metabolize or transfer energy, which means they cannot go through cellular respiration. They can't take in a chemical and change it into ATP. They also cannot go through photosynthesis, which changes and converts the sun's energy into molecules. And they cannot decompose or break down any kind of nutrients. So therefore, they're really not a living thing. And as we said, they're just teeny tiny particles that have either a DNA strand in them or an RNA strand wrapped around an outside coating of a protein coat. They are very tiny viruses, tiny, tiny, tiny. And if you look at this diagram, you can see we've looked at eukaryotic cells. And if you remember from the lab, we looked at your cheek cells, and we could see how tiny they were. We couldn't really see any organelles, but we also looked at bacteria cells. And if you remember, underneath our microscopes, they look like really just specks of dust. And a virus is way smaller than even those bacteria cells we looked at. And you would actually need an electron microscope, which can magnify something hundreds of thousands of times to see them. So we can't even see them with the microscopes that we have in our lab, or even if we had an expensive microscope, we couldn't see it. You'd need a super expensive electron microscope to see a virus. As you can see from the diagram, they're not much bigger than a basic complicated complex protein chain. So they're very, very tiny. And because of their size, that allows them to get inside of all other organisms. They can get into bacteria cells. They can get into plant cells. They can get into fungi. And, of course, they can easily get into animal cells. So they are quite dangerous little guys because of their size. How do they infect and reproduce in cells? Well, there's basically two ways in which they do this. The first one is the lytic cycle, and that is they're going to attach themselves to a cell, inject their nucleic acid, either their DNA or their RNA, then use the cell that they've injected in, all of the cell's enzymes, the RNA polymerase, the DNA polymerase, and go through the process of transcription and translation, make their own little body parts. So they're using the cell's machineries and its materials to build more little viruses. And then when it gets enough of them, they're going to assemble them all together, and then they lyse that cell, in other words, killing that cell, releasing all these newly made viruses to go out and attack more cells. That's the first way they can do it. The second way is very similar, but it's even sneakier than the first way. And this is called the lysogenetic. And they go in very similar. They attach themselves to a cell. They inject their DNA or their RNA, and then what they do is they're very sneaky. They incorporate their DNA or RNA into that organism's DNA and RNA. In other words, they gene splice themselves into that organism's DNA. So when that organism goes to replicate its DNA, in other words, make a copy of its own DNA, it's now also copying the virus's DNA. Then when that cell goes on to split apart or make a new cell, it is continuously in every single cell that's reproduced after that. And it will stay there for forever. But the bad thing is sometimes the lactic cycle and lysogenetic cycle work together. In that sense, if it's going to be sitting in your cell for a while, what might happen is your body or the organism may become run down and the immune system isn't working so well. So the cell will jump into the lactic cycle. In other words, the genes that are been sitting for a long time in that host organism will come and go through transcription and translation and create more viruses, and then it will assemble them, and then it will lyse out, and so that cell will then die and have lots more viruses. A common example of that would be kind of like a cold sore that you might have, in that it got into you, it's sitting there waiting and not doing anything, but it's still in your nerve cell, and then when you get run down or your immune system isn't working so well, it will then go into lactic cycle, and you'll develop that cold sore. Again, your immune system will take over, shut it down. But that DNA information from that virus is in your cells all the time, forever, waiting to take its opportune moment to come back and jump into the lactic cycle and reproduce. And that's why viruses are so dangerous. It's because they're tricky little things, and they can wreak havoc at a moment's notice. What are some common ones that you guys have been exposed to? Well, most of the time humans would be dealing with retinoviruses. And a retinovirus basically means that it's made up of the RNA nucleic acid, not the DNA. And you can see in the picture there we have a very typical, the pink skinny little lines would be your RNA, and it's surrounded by the lovely little circles of a protein coat. This one also happens to have an envelope which allows it to fuse, as I said earlier, into our cells and get into our cells rather easily. So the common cold, flu, HIV, rabies, chickenpox are all very common viruses that exist out there. And then there are an awful lot of plant viruses that are very common as well that you should sort of become familiar with, and that would be the tobacco mosaic virus, which infects tobacco plants. And then there's some, even if you're a vegetable grower, the tomato yellow virus is one that infects tomato plants and diminishes the productivity of producing really nice, healthy fruit. So those are quite common. How do viruses spread? Generally, viruses from humans are going to spread in an airborne pathway. But again, there's many different ways. Airborne is sneezing or coughing without covering your mouth or your nose, and they travel in the air and land on someone. Now, if it just lands on your skin, it can't really survive for a long time, but it has to then get into your cells. So like if you touched your nose, depending upon what type of virus it is it a virus that only attacks respiratory cells? Is it a virus that attacks intestinal cells? It has to get to the cell that it really can stick to and inject itself into. So you have to be very careful when you're around someone with a cold or the flu, and that you got to constantly wash your hands so that you're not touching your face and getting that virus into the cells that it's going to attack. Insects carry viruses into plants commonly. Animals transfer them to other animals as well. Example of HIV, people sharing needles or exchanging bodily fluids. And then unfortunately, in some instances, some viruses can be transported in foods and water if they've been contaminated or not cared for properly. Most of you are aware also that we do have vaccines for viruses, and all a vaccine is a simple they take they take pieces of that particular pathogen or that particular virus that wouldn't cause it to be able to replicate in you, but they take little tiny pieces of it and they inject them into you so that your immune system can recognize that particle and start building antigens and antibodies to break it down, so that when you get a full-blown exposure, you already have the chemicals made in your body to fight and destroy that. Most of you are familiar with a common cold, taking about 10 days. So it gets in your body and it takes 3 days for it to replicate and go through and lyse and really get into high enough numbers. And that's when you start to feel achy and tired and like you're not feeling right. So it's starting to use your cell's machineries to increase its numbers. Then you have it for 3 to 4 more days and you're just nasty. And all this time, your body is working feverishly to develop and identify drugs that can kill and get rid of it. And so you have it sort of for 3 more days, breaking it down and putting it into small enough numbers so that it doesn't have any major effect on you. Antibiotics have absolutely no use to viruses, and that's because antibiotics are generally geared towards invading cells, like a bacterial cell, and killing it. Viruses are not cells, so antibiotics don't do anything. So you can't really take any medicines for the common virus. You can take things that might maybe help your symptoms, like a runny nose or pain and aches, but the medicine isn't doing anything to speed up the process or kill the virus in any way. So it's a common misconception that antibiotics will help the common cold or the common flu, and it really doesn't do anything whatsoever. So if we summarize viruses, they're not living organisms. They are not made up of cells. They cannot reproduce or survive on their own. They always need a host to use all the host's machinery and mechanisms so that it can make new parts for itself. They cannot take in or transform any kind of energy on their own. They are really only made up of DNA or an RNA, depending upon which type of virus you're talking about, and a protein coat. Very few, or some have envelopes on the outside, and some even have enzymes. But mostly they're just particles of DNA and RNA with a protein coat. They're very, very small, and they can infect absolutely all types of living organisms. The other flip side is they're dangerous. They mutate all the time, and they do not respond to antibiotics. And that is, if they're mutating all the time, if you had a flu shot in September, for example, and you weren't exposed to that flu until December or something, it's gone through so many mutations that it's not going to be recognized by your body as the same organism. So the flu shot may not work for you, and that's because they mutate so quickly and so fast. So you're going to review your notes at this point. Make sure you can tell me what viruses are made up of. Why aren't they considered living? How do viruses infect cells? How do viruses reproduce? Basically, you got to know both ways. And can you give some examples of viruses? How do viruses spread? What is a vaccine? And make sure you have all of the vocab listed at the front as part of your notes. Thanks very much. See you in class.